Alrighty, yo, what is going on, everybody? It's your boy, Mr. DDG94, back with another reaction video. Today, we're going to react to the strength of Magic's competition. So, basically, this is the strength of Magic Johnson's competition. This is to validate all the people he's faced throughout the playoffs or finals or whatever. Obviously, we know his highest level of competition would be Jordan, Bird, and Isaiah in the Pistons. Yeah, he's had some other competition as well. Y'all need to stop disrespecting the 80s, man. Them 80s players was just as good as any players from the 90s to 2000s and today. So start putting some respect on them players from the 80s, because they did kind of pave the way for the future. Just saying. Put some respect on their name. Stop calling them plumbers. They're not plumbers. Okay? These were $1 million athletes around this time. How you $1 million athlete and a plumber? Fuck out of here. Y'all need to put some respect on their name, man.
So there's been many different eras in basketball history, and in specifically the 80s, that decade is known for a few major aspects. Magic Johnson and Larry Bird's rivalry, the beginning of Michael Jordan's career, and of course, the Bad Boy Pistons. But outside of that, there's still many talented teams and players who don't get the attention they deserve.
Facts.
Today, upon viewer request, I'm diving into the Western Conference in the 1980s as we evaluate how good and how deep that conference was at this period. We're starting off with the most obvious team, the Los Angeles Lakers. They were a legitimate super team led by their trio of Magic Johnson, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and James Worthy. We already know a ton about the first two. Magic Johnson was the greatest point guard of basketball history, who led the Lakers' fast-paced and high-octane offense to earn the nickname Showtime. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, known as the captain, was still an elite center in the league, although he was past his prime days of the 1970s. Still, he fit in beautifully as a big man in Magic's fast break. And when the Lakers chose to slow it down, there was no better way to get a sure bucket than dropping it into the post where Kareem could use his indefensible skyhook shot. The guy who's the most underrated one in this mix is Big Game James Worthy,
Facts.
whose nickname was very fitting considering the fact that
underrated.
he was one of the most clutch performers the game has ever seen. He averaged around 20 points per game during his prime, and the 6'9" small forward had one of the quickest first steps the game has ever seen. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. James Worthy deserves his own statue outside of Staples Center. Without him, the Lakers certainly don't win the 1998 NBA championship over the Pistons in 7 games.
I can understand
In that seventh and deciding game,
He does.
James dropped 36, 16, and 10 on 68% shooting
That's
and was
crazy.
named the Finals MVP of that series. Along with that all-time great trio, they also had a significant amount of depth, including their 6'5" shooting guard, Michael Cooper, who was a part of all 5 of their championship runs that decade. Cooper was one of the original 3-and-D type of players, and he's one of the great defensive players that most young viewers have never heard of. He made 8 straight all-defense teams that decade and was the 1987 Defensive Player of the Year. They also had a quality transition scorer in Byron Scott, and they also had a 6th Man of the Year candidate, Michael Thompson, in the second half of the decade. Considering how overpowered this juggernaut was, it's no wonder they represented the West in the NBA Finals 8 out of 10 seasons. The second team we're looking at is the Houston Rockets. They were not great in the first half of the decade, but after acquiring Hakeem Olajuwon in the 1984 draft, that all would quickly change. The Twin Tower combination of Ralph Sampson and Hakeem Olajuwon quickly made them prominent contenders in the West. They also had key scoring sparks like Lewis Lloyd and Robert Reed. They made it as far as the NBA Finals in 1986, and after they had defeated the favored Lakers in the West Finals, the hype around this team was immense. With Hakeem at the age of 23 and Sampson at the age of 25, it seemed as if it was only a matter of time before the league was theirs. Unfortunately, their success was short-lived, and so was the career of Sampson, as he began dealing with significant back and knee problems that had him out of the league by the time he was barely into his 30s. The next team is one of the less talked about and fascinating gems of the 1980s, and that's the Denver Nuggets. They were led by 2 solid and relatively unknown stars, Alex English and Fat Lever. Of all the players in the entirety of the 1980s, no one scored more total points than Alex English, who averaged as high as 29.8 points per game in 1986. He was an incredibly efficient 6'7" small forward who had a lethal mid-range jump shot with an extremely high release point that was rarely blocked. which led him to make 8 straight All-Star teams in that era. His co-star was the 6'3" point guard / shooting guard Lafayette Lever, known as Fat Lever for short. Lever was a pretty good distributor and a reliable scorer who was very close to 20 points per game during his prime. With this duo leading the way, Denver had an extremely fast and potent offense. In 6 out of the 10 seasons that decade, Denver led all teams in points scored. They were a contender, and they had a potential championship team if it wasn't for one major problem. They were terrible defensively, and when I say terrible, I mean excruciatingly awful. The concept was basically that the best defense was more offense. Every season that decade, they finished as a bottom 5 team in points allowed, including 4 straight seasons where they were the worst in the entire league. Despite all of their defensive woes, this team still made it to the conference semifinals 4 times, and they made it to the Western Conference Finals in 1985, where they lost in 5 games to the eventual champion Los Angeles Lakers. Then there was the Utah Jazz, who were among the worst teams in the league for the first half of the decade. But around the mid-80s is when they added Karl Malone and John Stockton, and their fortunes began to shift. Malone and Stockton are most famously known for their 2 trips to the NBA Finals in 1997 and 1998, but their best seasons statistically actually came in the late 80s. Nobody really reflects on the 80s Jazz as a Big 3 team, but you could, considering the underrated big man they had down low, the 7'4" monster Mark Eaton. Despite not being very well known, Mark was one of the greatest defensive players to ever live.
Facts.
To say that it was difficult to score over Mark in the paint would be a massive understatement, as he made 5 all-defense teams, was the Defensive Player of the Year twice, and he led the league in blocks 4 times, including the 1985 season where he averaged 5.6 blocks per game. Officially, that's the highest blocks per game average for a season in NBA history. They also had one of the forgotten great leapers of years past, the 6'4" shooting guard Daryl Griffith. Daryl could score and he had a reliable jump shot, but what he was known for more than anything was his incredible dunks, which earned him the nickname Dr. Dunkenstein. He wasn't a great defensive player, but he scored over 20 points a game for his first 5 seasons. Unfortunately, injuries shortened his career, and he began having those injuries right around the time that Malone and Stockton joined the team, so their prime didn't quite overlap, as he was only a 10 to 15 points per game scorer by the time that Malone and Stockton broke out as superstars. Despite being rich in talent, they still were not able to get past Magic Johnson's super team, getting as far as Game 7 of the 1988 West Semifinals, where the eventual champion Lakers closed it out. Another team who was making deep runs in the West playoffs was the well-balanced Dallas Mavericks. Their leading star was the elite scorer, Mark Aguirre, who spent his prime 8 seasons with the Dallas Mavericks before he eventually won 2 championships with the Bad Boy Pistons. He put up strong numbers in his years as a Maverick, averaging as high as 29.5 points per game in 1984. His co-star was the reliable and consistently good scorer, Rolando Blackman. The 6'6" guard was another one of those great mid-range shooters of the 80s, and his prime years saw about 20 points per game on over 50% shooting.
Dang.
Some great role players got their start there as well, like one of the original stretch 4 shooters, the 6'9" Sam Perkins, and a future 6-man of the year, the 6'10" Detlef Schrempf. At their best 3-year stretch with their many weapons, this unit was seen as a legitimate threat to the Lakers. And in 1988, they made it to the Western Conference Finals, where they pushed Magic, Kareem, and Worthy's Lakers to 7 games before Los Angeles closed it out. The last one to highlight is more so a player than an entire team, and that's the 6'10" power forward Tom Chambers. He was a 4-time All-Star and one of the premier scorers of that decade. His greatest performance was a 60-point explosion in a revenge game against his former team. He was an incredible athlete who could play above the rim and has one of the most ridiculous-looking dunks of all time. He spent most of his years in the 80s with the Seattle Supersonics, but it wasn't until he joined the Phoenix Suns that he got his first taste of competing. In 1989, Chambers and Kevin Johnson led the Suns to a 55-27 record, while Chambers was averaging over 25 points per game. They then cruised to the Western Conference Finals before they were swept by the defending champion Lakers. These were pretty much all of the competing teams in the Western Conference during the 80s. Although I do think there was some pretty solid teams, and you could certainly argue that the West 80s was underrated, they certainly weren't as strong as the fiercely competitive Eastern Conference. In the 1980s, there were 25 50-win teams in the Western Conference. In the 80s for the Eastern Conference, there was 35 50-win teams, which pretty much sums up the balance of power during that decade. And that's certainly interesting because it's arguably the last decade we've seen where the East was stronger than the West. The West in the 80s certainly wasn't one of the greatest conferences we've ever seen, but due to the rich Eastern Conference in that decade, and due to the overpowered Lakers representing the West in the NBA Finals 8 out of 10 years, there have unfortunately been some nice teams and quality players who've become lost and overlooked in the game's history. Hopefully this video helped shine a spotlight on some of them. If this turns into some kind of a series, then I'll consider ranking each decade's conference as the series goes on. But first, you gotta let me know whether or not you enjoyed this video and if you would like me to make more like it. Thanks for watching as always, make sure to like and subscribe for more basketball content, and I'll see you guys in the next video.
Alrighty, so that's just gonna about do it for this one. Can y'all please stop calling them people plumbers now? Did you not see them stats? Those stats is crazy, bro. They was just as good as the players of today, bro. These players back in the 80s was just as good as the players of today. You saw them stats. You saw what it is. So now that you educated, now that you're more educated on these players now, could y'all stop disrespecting them, please? They don't deserve the disrespect. They just as good as any of these players from today. The only difference is back then they didn't shoot a lot of threes. The floor wasn't spaced out like that. You had to have a certified big man down low. It was a lot different back then. So please stop disrespecting them, calling them plumbers, because they're not. These guys were more than capable of handling being able to hang in the league today. Stop disrespecting these dudes, for real.